beyond the realm of man, until we've thoroughly tested every last close-chested view. Find the more you think you know, the less you really do. Where would we be without THC? We know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Where would we be without THC? The Higher Side Chat Show. Greg Carlwood and Company.
All right, Higher Side Chatters, we know the world is a Game of Thrones style tug of war for power, influence, and control among ever-emerging think tanks, consortiums, and cabals whose only true common ground is the acknowledgement that the people are a resource to be slowly drained and exploited if you can only get them to believe you're on their side. To me, that's history in a nutshell, and our modern era is no different, just a slow erosion of any ground that's been gained, with the oily appendages of these nefarious factions relentlessly creeping in from all sides. Yes, it seems the only true choice of the people is how we want our centralized, top-down authoritarian system packaged and gift-wrapped, because for all the talk about social structures, political philosophies, and personal utopias, those seem to be the irremovable yokes and shackles around our necks. Well, folks, a deep dive into these very issues is the offering on the Higher Side table today, as our resident alchemy and alternative science expert Shamangineer has requested we take a break from our elemental series to explore fascism more closely. So let's get into it. He taught us about ether and Ormus in Show 1, broke down earth alchemy and advanced permaculture practices in Show 2, and of course explained the forefront of water science and the suppressed and unknown qualities of H2O in Show 3. Here again to blow more minds than the U.S. military, Shamangineer, my man. Welcome back.
Excellent as always. You got the best introductions on the web, so.
Just the old 9 to 5.
So I'll dive right into it. Basically, what we're discussing today is fascism.
Sure.
And for most people, fascism has this, kind of dual nature. One people will describe it one way, one people will describe it another way, depending on your view. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and get into the historical perspective, and then we can build it up from there. How's that sound?
That sounds great.
First of all, in the 18th century, when the United States was founded, there were basically two modes of thought with regard to government. So there was the Jeffersonian and the Hamiltonian, or the Federalist and the Republican stances. Now, the Federalist was the Hamiltonian version, where big government and federal authority was paramount, and it overrode the states' rights, and small government was basically involved in the Jeffersonian stance, as well as state authority being Jeffersonian. Now, each of these philosophies is, of course, taking place within the democratic context, so that positions of authority are granted by the will of the people at the ballot box, but also within this context, there's a hierarchical bureaucracy. These arguments are still alive today, but basically the Federalist standpoint of federal authority and big government has continued to gain more footing with time. One thing which is not really discussed at all today is the role that corporations played after the revolution in this country, and it was extremely limited. It was understood that these artificial constructs had the potential to undermine the fledgling democracy and should be limited to prevent an abuse of power. The colonials had fought too hard against the Hudson Bay and East India Tea Company, whose tea was tossed overboard during the Boston Tea Party, to allow large businesses to spring up after the foundation of the United States. To accomplish this, corporations were creations of the state at the state level, bounded to accomplish a specific task for a set period of time, and they could not participate in politics. Neither could they own stock in other corporations, and they were ultimately responsible to the people. If it was found that a corporation was violating its charter by acting against the public good, it would be disbanded, and people who were found responsible for the violation were liable for damages incurred. So initially this worked well, and in the 1800s, there were about 200 corporations that were doing what they were chartered to do, with a few exceptions, especially the First and Second Banks of America, they remained within the bounds of their charter.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting because we talk a lot about the founders trying to get away from various forms of oppression, but they were dealing with companies like the Hudson Bay Company or the East India Tea Company in particular. So they were very wise to how out of control corporations can get. And so here you see all these regulations on them to try to keep them, bound to the people. And of course, as time goes on, they erode that. But it is interesting to go back and think about corporations in that context because it's really underreported on.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, in the 1850s, there were very strong antitrust regulations. So, I mean, basically at that point, before the 30s even, you had a very contained corporate influence within this country. Now, what changed was basically during the Civil War, corporations made huge profits from procurement contracts. They took advantage of the disorder to corrupt and buy the legislators, even presidents. And corporations became the masters and keepers of business. What Abraham Lincoln said was, corporations have been enthroned. An era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power will endeavor to prolong its reign by working on the prejudices of the people until wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. So in the wake of the Civil War restrictions, the power wielded by corporations was greatly eroded. They had laws governing their creation amended. State charters could no longer be revoked. Corporate profits could no longer be limited. And corporate economic activity could be restrained only by the courts. In hundreds of cases, granted corporations minor legal victories, conceding rights and privileges they had not seen before.
See, and that makes total sense too, just because how many times in history have we seen these cabals use times of war and chaos to further their own agendas behind the curtain while everybody's focused on the battlefield?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, basically that's move number one.
Right, exactly.
I mean, if you want to do something, start a war first or cause an attack or something along those lines.
Right. But I wonder how many people ever really think about corporate power changing to such a degree because of the distraction of the Civil War. Of course, it's not only a distraction, but for the things to have happened that happened behind the curtain, these changes in the structure of corporations, I mean, it changed the world.
Definitely. Definitely. That is what gave rise to the robber barons.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, most people think that Citizens United was what made private corporations a natural citizen under the U.S. Constitution, but it actually goes much further back than that. In the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, there was a dispute over a railbed route, and the U.S. Supreme Court deemed that a private corporation was a natural person under the U.S. Constitution and therefore entitled to protection under the Bill of Rights. And at that point, corporations enjoyed the same rights and sovereignty that was enjoyed by the average citizen, and more so because of their power and influence. And that was in 1886. So by about 1920, the corporations actually employed more than 80% of the workforce in the United States. So in that 40, 50 years, they came to dominate everything. And that was actually the point where small business was not really a factor in terms of driving votes or anything like that. The politicians didn't care about small business at that point. It was only big business, big trusts, and big corporations.
Right. It seems to kind of parallel the struggle early America had with banking as well. We've gone through several iterations of Federal Reserves or central banks before we got the one that really stuck. But it did seem like a back and forth between people who have seen these problems before, trying to make a new type of civilization and society that kept them more in check, and then these same old forces just trying to weasel their way in relentlessly. They're just so persistent that it's just hard to keep them in check, for sure.
Yeah, and the next place where there was, a really big movement with regard to this is actually, during the Wall Street crash and things like that. So, at that point, there were, millions of people out of work, and there were bread lines, and people were jumping on rail cars to try and find work wherever they could. At that point, basically, is when FDR said, we need a new deal. And when he said that, Wall Street was panicking because they're like, oh my gosh, we can't have all this progressive stuff, all this, more socialized workforce coming through, because it'll basically erode what we've been building up since the Civil War. And so at the time, fascism was growing in Europe, and they decided to see what they could do in terms of fomenting a fascist coup in the United States. And so in order to start a coup in the United States, somebody was sent to Germany to see what was going on over there, and that was Gerald McGuire. And when he finished his scouting trip, he was basically used to approach a champion of the soldier, and that was Major General Smedley Butler. So basically what they wanted to do was take this large group of veterans who'd been protesting and use them to act as kind of a brown shirt organization to take over DC. And the reason why there was all this anger from these veterans was because at the end of World War I, they were given $60 and a train ticket home as the extent of their mustering out pay. Now, veterans associations were formed to try and get a better deal, and they ended up getting an agreement where they would each be provided about $1,000 in the form of a bonus certificate that would grow with value over the years, and it would be able to be cashed out in 20 years. So when the Great Depression struck, a lot of these veterans ended up losing their jobs. They didn't have anything at that point, and they started basically a tent city in Washington, D.C. to try and get their pensions paid out. And Smedley Butler was actually somebody who was there speaking out for the veterans at the time. So he won a lot of favor with them from that. But also during World War I, he was in charge of a camp in Europe, and all the people who went through there saw him as someone who was really pro-soldier, who was, always trying to stand up for them and give them what they needed to be happy and do their job. So when he was approached by Gerald McGuire, basically what he said was, we're going to have an organization, it's going to start up, and it's going to help fund and help promote you and your movement. And right now we're just going to get it out there. And that was the American Liberty League. And the people who were in support of that were people like General Foods, makers of Maxwell House Coffee, Birdseye, Colgate, U.S. Steel, Heinz, General Motors. A lot of that came out during the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, which was an investigation of all this after Smedley Butler and a reporter that he basically brought into his confidence brought their evidence to Congress.
Right. I thought that was just a fascinating chapter of history that isn't talked about. I watched that Plot to Overthrow FDR documentary that you sent, and it is just so crazy that you have this, again, really generically named Liberty League cooked up by the heads of these very corporations that we know are clearly not the good guys. In the documentary, they also say JP Morgan was a big financial backer of this. So, of course, these should be red flags that are like, wait a second, I don't know if I want what these guys want. And sure enough, they tried to stage this coup. And if it wasn't for Butler being like, actually, I'm not going to lead a revolution against the president, it could have happened.
Yeah, well, they were talking about, I think, 500,000 or 600,000 veterans marching on DC, kind of crossing the Rubicon, as it were, in order to cement this and basically cause that transition of power.
And also, I think Prescott Bush was involved at some degree with this, right?
Yeah, I believe Hamburg American Line, or UBS, the bank that he was in charge of, was involved with the American Liberty League. But both the Hamburg American Line and UBS, for union banking, were involved in banking with the Nazis, funding them during the war. And the Hamburg American Line was also involved in transporting American journalists to Nazi Germany and Nazi spies coming back on the boats on their way back prior to the war. So he was definitely tied up in all this. And actually, Prescott Bush was the father of Herbert Walker Bush, and the ties, continued when Herbert Walker Bush was running for president against, I think it was Clinton, the second time around. He had to basically expunge some people from his campaign who were, these weren't just Nazi sympathizers, they were full-blown Nazi war criminals. So, that's the level of, it's like direct. It's a direct connection right there. And then basically, these ties continued through to the younger Bush during his years, just not to as prominent a degree as that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Anyone can fast forward kind of from the FDR chapter we're talking about and see the successes and failures of the fascists in America. Clearly, they got pretty high on the pyramid as time went on.
Yeah. So, I believe it's Glenn Yeadon talks about the CIA itself being a basically Nazi fascist organization at its founding. The OSS, it was largely made up of military people and Wall Street people who were recruited from Wall Street. And it's like, why are they recruiting, financial advisors and stockbrokers and stuff like that? It's because, there were kind of two groups in the OSS. There was those who were primarily about the military side, but then there were the people who were making sure that they'd be fulfilling financial interests. And it was more the financial interests that took over the leadership as the CIA was founded. And also there was this huge influx of paperclip Nazis that were joining the ranks as well. Basically, they were getting their hands on anybody they could to make sure that, they stayed out of the Soviets' hands.
Right. And I love that concept of Nazi survival, the kind of stuff that Joseph Farrell and Catherine Austin Fitts talk about. And they take it into that realm of tracking the black budget as evidence for a breakaway civilization born out of this Nazi survival. Farrell uses the term fascist international quite a bit. And it is just fascinating because there definitely seems to be evidence that that plan was in place when you look at things like the Red House report. And in it, they talk about an eventual re-emergence. And so it does make you curious how long it would lay dormant before that re-emergence would happen.
Well, in that report, they talk about it basically initially being a economic coalition. And then at some point, it would kind of foment into the Reich. There would be this political conversion that would take place. And I think that, we've seen with the creation of the EU, and, we've gone through those financial cycles since 2008, where every time Greece is, hard up for cash, who do they go running to? It's Germany, because Germany is really kind of the economic hegemony of the EU. Then just recently, Germany started to consolidate their military with other European military units. And I think that's part of the implementation of that second part of the Red House report.
Mm-hmm. And one of the articles you had sent me about that even talks about the very specific 3-part plan that involved embedding their people in certain corporations and laying low in that regard. And it's like, yeah, a lot of that has happened. What are the big corporations? The oil industry, big pharma, which is petrochemicals. And we always talk about on conspiracy shows like this, eugenics campaigns, which is Nazi ideology. And a lot of German companies do seem to still be at the head of their respective industries.
Well, you talked about eugenics, and the Nazi eugenics program was actually based on American eugenics programs in the early 20th century. Also, even today, some of the heads of the Human Genome Project are grandsons of Nazi sympathizers. One of them was a grandson of Dulles, and another one was a grandson of Harriman. So, Brown Brothers Harriman. So, the elites love to keep things within the family. They are obsessed with their bloodlines and everything like that. And that deals in part with why this stuff keeps getting handed down.
Right. It didn't seem like World War II had a good way to end except for them to go underground. It's not like the Nazis necessarily lost the war. They just kind of dispersed.
So basically during the war, many industrialists in the United States and in Britain were involved with supporting the Nazis. Supporters in America included Remington, Ford, GM, GE, IBM, Standard Oil, DuPont. Also, the Nazi propaganda machine was based off of Edward Bernays' propaganda techniques and things like that were developed after World War I. And the American education system was also based on German education when that was set up. I mean, this is prior to the war, but that was set up in the late 19th, early 20th century with Carnegie's and other industrialists setting up these schools. And they were based basically on two things. There was the caste system in India. That's why we have school districts. And then the other thing was horse training techniques, which were eventually turned into a indoctrination program by the Weimar Republic. And so those were the two bases that went into creating our modern day educational system in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So getting back to the transactions that were going on during the war, FDR knew that there was money and weapons and fuel and ammunition that were being provided to Germany through these American companies, and often an intermediary in one of the neutral countries like Switzerland or Norway or, things like that. And those intermediaries, would get their cut and then they'd forward it on to the Germans. And so a lot of these business contacts were what the Germans ended up utilizing once they got out of the country. And those rat lines that were used to get the Germans out of the country were actually founded by the Catholic Church, because they had basically diplomatic immunity for couriers, and they would be able to coordinate this without anybody stumbling across it. And they also helped to fund the Nazis, and they didn't want that to be known. So they ended up helping them with their survival plan. And actually, at the end of the war, the American forces were basically coming in and, with the British and things like that. But the groups that are basically founded to control post-war Germany were actually being seated with these Nazi sympathizers. And they told the Allies to go talk to the Catholic priests in each of those towns to find out who were good people to run that town or run this industry or run that as that transition took place. So who do you think they pointed out?
Of course. It's like classic regulatory capture. It's something we talk about all the time, that the FDA is not actually there for your safety. These agencies that we think are in place to protect us from the nefarious corporations that really don't give a fuck, they're just as compromised. So it only provides a false sense of security. And that, of course, gets into left and right feelings about these agencies that people on the far right would be like, well, let's get rid of them because they're no good. And it's like, well, that seems like it's not going to be any better. The point is we need to make them work for us, not disband them completely. Otherwise, we will just have glyphosate-soaked crops and everybody will be on petrochemical pills more than they already are.
Well, regulatory agencies nowadays, they're, paper tigers or toothless lions or whatever you want to call them. They're just kind of a placeholder for what we should really have. But a lot of them actually act as more of a shield for these corporate and industrial interests, because they present this public facade that we're doing stuff when actually they're just kind of like crossing the I's and dotting the T's or something like that.
Right. And then they become the dominant authorities on what's good in a certain sector. And so then it also works against the alternatives that we've talked about in the past, which is like people start to think, oh, well, if something doesn't have that FDA stamp of approval, it's probably not going to work, or it might even be harmful. So you're gambling with your own health and safety if you don't trust the experts. So it really is like a double whammy for people and a serious win-win for these guys.
Yeah. So getting back to the end of the war, FDR knew that, a lot of these transactions were taking place, but he actually died just a few weeks after the end of the war. And what his plan had been was, once the Allies came into Germany, they were going to get a hold of the German bankers and have them finger their accomplices in the United States. But because of his death, and he was holding all of his contacts about who he knew about who were Nazi sympathizers in the United States, once he died, that didn't really go anywhere because he was keeping it so close. He didn't really tell anybody what was going on because he feared that it might get out to the wrong people. So that's one of the big reasons why after the war, it was just allowed to flourish.
Yeah.
So at this point, I think it would probably be best to start going into Reich and Reich's views on fascism.
Fair enough. Before we go into that, I just wanted to ask and maybe step back and say, you know, we're doing this elemental series. Why step in and do a fascism episode specifically now? Like, we really didn't say up front why this does seem to be so timely in your opinion, or why it might be so important right now to get into this history, fascinating as it is.
Well, I mean, I've been keeping an eye on this for a while, and, you know, a lot of my research into Operation Gladio touched on this and things like that. So it really has to do a lot with what we're seeing today in terms of the political climate. You're seeing Nazis marching in the streets, and you're seeing this clash of ideologies that's happening all over America between families, you know, and between different groups that are allying each other. And just the whole way it's going seems like, you know, it's all being kind of steered towards fascism either way.
Right.
When you look at a lot of what's going on the left and on the right, they're both talking about, you know, I mean, just look at, okay, there's this whole fake news thing going on, and what's the response is to say, okay, well, we're going to say this is fake news, or we're going to say that's fake news. But it's just kind of like ranking systems and algorithms, and, you know, not things that actually would explain why or what's the methodology that's going into this. It's just kind of like, here's what's good for you, eat up.
Exactly. It's like, it's easy to criticize the right, of course, right now, because they are the party in power. But you are correct in that it seems to be coming from both sides. I think it's just because both sides are so polarized to such extremes that the idea of cooperation is impossible. So then it becomes, well, I just need to get my way. And how do you get your way is fascism. You know, you get your way with dictators and authority and centralized control. And the left has got this punch a Nazi meme, which from a centrist interpretation is punch anyone who doesn't agree with me. As long as they're labeled a Nazi, it's okay to incite violence against them. You got them doing the word police stuff, attacking all these comedians. They want everything to be PC. I mean, this is nanny state type stuff, and I fucking hate it. But then, of course, on the right, you look at Trump's cabinet. I mean, people, I don't know how people think this guy is on their side. You can just go down the list. I actually took a big list out of one of the articles that you gave me, and it says that 5 of the 15 people nominated by Trump as cabinet secretaries have no public sector experience and have only spent their entire careers in the corporate sector. That would be more business people with no public sector experience than have ever served in any cabinet at any one time. That Betsy DeVos chick, she's the education secretary. She's been a billionaire married to an Amway conglomerate. Andrew Putster has been nominated as labor secretary. He's a billionaire CEO of a fast food chain.
Well, don't forget DeVos's, you know, brother is the head of Blackwater.
Right. Yeah. That's another connection. That Wilbur Ross guy, who is a nominee for Commerce Secretary, he's a billionaire financier who invests in buying and selling companies in distressed industries specifically, who made his entire fortune or who made his early fortune as a fund manager at the Rothschild Group. It's just crazy. Vincent Viola, Trump's nominee for Army Secretary, he's a billionaire, former chairman of the New York Mercantile Exchange. These are all connected people. Gary Cohn worked for Goldman Sachs. So, like, if you're going to criticize Obama's cabinet for being stacked with CFR members and lawyers that work for banks, you got to do the same thing here. What about Rex Tillerson, the dude from ExxonMobil? Like, he is not a good candidate for Secretary of State just because he ran a fucking oil company. So it really is sickening to see these exact same people in a cabinet of what's thought to be the polar opposite party. It's just nonsense.
Yeah, I agree completely. Before we get to the Reich stuff, I think I'll talk about Operation Gladio, Carol Rosin and Werner von Braun, and a bit more of the Red House plan. That's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
So one of the things that, I think is worth mentioning with regard to the Nazis is also that there's a witness in the form of Dr. Carol Rosin. She used to work with Werner von Braun when he was at Fairchild Industries. And what he told her, he was dying of cancer at the time, was basically that there's going to be a push for space-based weapons, and there's going to be several phases to what's going to be driving this. The first is basically the communists, which she already saw at the time. And then he said it was going to be basically terrorists, countries of interest, what we call them now, but third-party tin pot dictators. Then it was going to be asteroids, and then an alien invasion is what he told her. And
right.
And what he said was, and it's all made up. None of it's true. It's all complete fiction. So the thing is that right there's a well-known Nazi who was at a high enough level to actually know what the heck was going on with this stuff. And another thing of it that's interesting with Werner von Braun is he did some Disney documentary films and stuff like that. There was one about space travel. And in that, he actually said that the future of space travel was electrogravitic craft. So that's another interesting thing. But basically what he was alluding to there with, terrorism was what has been known today as Operation Gladio. So at the end of World War II, basically what's happening is there's Germany split down the middle. You've got half of Germany over on the Soviet side. You got half of Germany on the NATO side. What a great way for it to end, for Germany to be able to play both sides off of each other, right?
Right.
And actually, when they were picking out people to be in charge of things in Germany during that Reconstruction period, the person they chose was, I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but he was basically an SS general who was put in charge of the secret services. And he started what they call the stay-behind missions and ran them in Europe. And those are where they had different units of soldiers from the Allies, but also a lot of them were former Nazis who were embedded in cells within Europe. And the initial plan for this was, okay, they're there in case of a Soviet invasion. But basically, once you had nuclear weapons take prominence in the 60s, basically once the stockpiles were built up on both sides, and there was kind of this, well, we don't want mutually assured destruction, so kind of a ground war isn't really on the plate for right now. There became this emphasis on clandestine operations and being able to leverage these people in the case of domestic threats. So in this case, what that meant was if there was opposition to certain policies, if there was a rising communist movement within the country and there was a vote coming up, then you'd see more of these terrorist attacks happen to kind of steer the country away from communism by these, you basically got Nazis being involved in all this, but what they were doing is they were creating these terrorist attacks and then false flag blaming them on communists.
Of course.
Or leftists.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the foundation. And this is, basically from like 1940s and 50s up through to the 90s that this was going on. So you're talking about 50 years. And then what happened was when it came out, there was this guy who was involved in one of these organizations, and he went to the press. And when he did that, it kind of blew this whole thing open. It turned out that, the secret services of all these different countries were involved, basically everybody in NATO, as well as the United States. And the CIA was involved, MI6 was involved, all these kind of clandestine groups. And it was this big brouhaha. So basically, those operations went inactive at that time. But there were also operations that were, set up in Greece and Turkey. And Turkey was what actually things fell back to. And kind of the more European operations up to the 90s, Daniel Ganser, he does a very good job of discussing those. And then going into Turkey and kind of the proliferation of what's called Gladio B networks, where you start getting into Arab terrorists and things like that. That's covered by Sibel Edmonds, who was a Turkish translator working at the FBI at the time, and she actually stumbled across, a cell within the FBI that was trying to, derail her investigations into 9/11, and then her partner on the Boiling Frogs Post podcast, James Corbett, he does a very good job of kind of elaborating on, how that's grown into this Islamic network and how it's gone back into Europe and things like that. And actually, one thing that's very important to note with all this is that Muhammad Atta, one of the hijackers in 9/11, he was actually, he already knew how to fly when he was learning how to fly in the United States in Florida. And he had 4 different passports and identities and things like that. And this is all coming from his girlfriend. There's a very good interview by the maker of the documentary Muhammad Atta's Flying Circus, and that's available on YouTube. But she basically talks about him, doing cocaine, drinking all the time. He always had, lots and lots of money. He was going to strip clubs and, not really the profile of a, adherent Islamicist, more of a fly-by-night CIA operative or something.
Right.
And when she says that when he actually, he was hanging out with South Africans and Austrians, and when he actually got his orders for what he was going to do, the guy he met with, his name was Reinhardt. So, you're talking about the same sort of group. And actually, Osama bin Laden, when he was growing up, he was being bounced on the knees of Nazis, because there was this whole relationship between Arab fascists, and actually there are all sorts of different fascists in different countries who actually went to work for the SS. There was an Indian SS contingent, Turkish SS contingent, all these different countries. And actually in Turkey, there was a general called Ataturk, and Ataturk was the one who slaughtered and killed millions of Armenians. And that was the model that Hitler used for his exterminations. So, there's all these ties between, the Germans and these Arab fascists. The primary group was the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
So, and all this stuff that we're seeing today in terms of terrorist attacks, I think it all kind of really boils down to this Nazi survival, this Nazi network that survived the war. And actually, Reinhard Gehlen was the head of German intelligence after the war, the SS general. And he was the one who was really pumping up Truman right after the war to see Russia as a threat. He was forwarding all this false intelligence telling him what they were doing that they weren't really doing.
Well, let me ask you this, just because I know it's going to come up in the comments section and a lot of listeners might be thinking, what about Israel's involvement in state-sponsored terrorism? Because in events like the Charlie Hebdo situation, it seems like you can reverse engineer it, look back from that point and see that world leaders who tended to be criticizing Israel's actions, they seem to be the countries who soon after got hit with some form of terrorism. So I felt like that was a pretty sound conclusion. And I don't think it has to be either or, of course. It's always anyone who spends time on the Nazis, you'll get comments, oh, well, you're distracting from the spotlight, which should be on Israel, and vice versa. But I don't understand why it can't be both. But I don't know. I guess I would just ask you, how would you fold that in?
Well, so, anybody who really takes an objective look at Israel, who are the Jewish fascists, right? I mean, look at what they're doing to the Palestinians.
Right.
If that isn't a multi-mile concentration camp, I don't know what is. Now, so basically the Zionists were kind of Jewish fascists, and they wanted to impose their authority on the Holy Land and take that over. And that was something that was basically implemented at the end of World War II. But leading up to that, Hitler actually struck a deal with the Zionists. Before the final plan was implemented, he would allow Zionist Jews to leave the country and go to Palestine. And so the Zionists were setting up little colonies in Palestine even before the war.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a kind of a subtle thing, because especially since most people don't know about that. But I mean, when you look at the aftermath in terms of what has happened to the people who used to live on the land, you can see that, clearly it's not a wholesome expression of government over there.
Of course. And, I didn't mean to take you off track, but it just seems to be one of those things that you have to mention on a show like this. Fascism comes in many different wrappers and many different flavors, and you'd be crazy not to oppose all of it.
Oh, definitely. And we're going to get into more of that as we continue.
Fair enough.
So, you kind of got to break it up into chunks because they're so big.
Yes, indeed.
Now I think we're ready for Reich.
Sure.
So Wilhelm Reich, we've talked about him before. He was a contemporary of Freud. But one thing that, we haven't talked about really is his talks and books about the role of fascism. And he wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And actually, he was pursued by both the SS and the KGB across multiple countries. So he's someone who's very familiar. He was also visited by the FBI, but that was basically to make sure that he wasn't a Nazi once he came to America.
I wanted to read this from our emails where you say just with a little more detail what you pretty much just said, and that Reich was pursued by the SS, KGB, and FBI over his theories, research, and books. There is also substantial evidence that it was a KGB mole in the FBI that actually got the case against Reich started that resulted in his incarceration and death shortly before his release of heart failure, quote unquote. But Reich, in fact, sits alone as the sole person in the history of the United States to have been required to burn his own books and research materials in a small bonfire on the lawn, or to have all copies of his books burned by court order in 1956 and 1960. He was also a part of the Nazi book burning. So if there's an authoritarian entity anywhere in the vicinity of Dr. Reich, he seems to have caught their attention and immediate wrath. And I think that's just great to point out, because it's like, yeah, any ideas the elite want to crush, those are ideas that I don't mind hearing about. You know what I'm saying? Like, clearly there's a reason to listen if no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on, these authority figures are like, no, crush this. This has to go away.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's probably a great place to start. The way he discussed it was as reactionary and revolutionary thought. What I would characterize that is more authoritarian and egalitarian thought. Authoritarianism is a structure dominated by fear, centralized authority, and psychological and sexual oppression. An egalitarian social structure is one in which is characterized by respect, consideration for all, a decentralized authority, and psychological and sexual freedom. I'd like to read a little bit from that primer I gave you on authoritarian and egalitarian thought.
Sure.
To just kind of give some very clear examples and different modes of philosophy. So, egalitarian values: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, reciprocity. Authoritarian values: look strong, successful, rich. Your strength must control your weakness. Strong men must control the weak. Votes rule for egalitarians. Democracy, rights as an effective vote. Equal opportunities and money and power. In authoritarian values, money rules. Oligarchy has the right to trick voters. They set privileges and ranks and money and power. Egalitarian values are human rights, freedom of the press and info, emancipation, integration, voting rights, women's suffrage, equal pay for equal work, nature conservation, Authoritarian values are property rights, freedom to own the press, slavery, people as property, segregation by race, wealth, poll taxes and intimidation, women's silence, traditional roles and rewards, and to exploit resources. There's some very clear differences in the way that these two philosophies think about how power should be expressed within the world. In his book, Reich makes the arguments that these modes of expression of power are not instilled in children primarily from their education or later employment, but rather in the structure of the family. It has been discussed previously on your show. For the first years of development, their brain waves are such that they're actually kind of in a trance for the first 5 to 8 years of their life. And that brainwave that's especially elevated is a theta brainwave. And actually, one thing I'd like to mention is that about 7 years is the length of time in anthroposophical schools where children's learning is characterized by play, and they're encouraged to explore the environment with supervision from an adult. So, I mean, even as far back as Rudolf Steiner, there seems to have been, he understood kind of what this meant in terms of how development should unfold. So it's during this time that the child's boundaries are being set and their character is developing that has a prime role in development of their role in society. If during these formative years boundaries are set on pure authority, a child learns not to question authority, as this is often met with punishment. In a more egalitarian method of child rearing, children are taught the reasons at a rudimentary level behind the boundaries being set, and if questions are posed, further answers are given. These two modes of rearing may be characterized as patriarchal and matriarchal, as each embodies either projective or receptive modes of expression. These modes of the modes of sexual expression allowable to children are also very different in these philosophical foundations. So in his book, Reich discusses matriarchal families as being primarily characteristic of indigenous societies and patriarchal societies being characterized by civilized societies. And if you look at kind of the way that they look at livestock, in indigenous societies, typically what would happen is you would hunt, but the animal, it's free to express itself. It moves throughout the land. There aren't any fences blocking it off. And it's basically, it is what it is. And you're just going out and taking what you need. Whereas with the civilized societies, they've decided to put strict limits on the movement and behavior of their animals, domesticating them and basically dominating them for their control. And so I think this is something to take into consideration when you understand the ways that these two mindsets look at people, just other living creatures to begin with. In matriarchal societies, childhood sexual expression tends to be characterized by the choices of the child with guidance. They're allowed to play doctor and do whatever they want, as long as it's not, something that's really disturbed or pathological. In patriarchal societies, childhood expression is characterized by its negation. Children and adolescents are discouraged at every turn from exploring their sexuality until biological maturity or marriage. And primarily in patriarchal societies, traditionally, it's been marriage. So that's actually a way of controlling the rights of sexuality in the case of arranged marriages, which were often the case in the past.
Mm-hmm.
This repression prevents natural expression of the child's most basic biological drives and retarded and confined the psychological development of the child. At its essence, childhood is the act of adapting and developing biology to the environment. And to restrict that development is to embed pathology in the psychology of the child. Reich previously researched these mechanisms on his concepts of character and body armoring in his work Character Analysis. Reich also speaks out about communism and the mass psychology of fascism. The communists suppressed Dr. Reich's theories, and we talked about him being pursued by the KGB. Now, that actually happened as a result of a KGB agent who was writing articles for Harper's and the New Republic. And one thing that's really interesting there is actually that same organization who was writing these articles had Henry Wallace, the former vice president of FDR, as one of the KGB agents involved. And he was actually kicked out of the FDR administration run for I believe, his second term because of these affiliations.
Interesting. So let's just back up a little bit to some of Reich's ideas, because I really am intrigued by extreme levels of control. I just find it fascinating, and whether it's right or wrong, I just like to explore those types of ideas. So the thought that something like the nuclear family, which in our society seems fairly automatic or self-evident just from our context, to think that that could be engineered, the model of father and mother as sole authority figures being engineered to create a structured order, like the separation from the tribe, and I guess most importantly, prepare children for a life of servitude, especially since, like you say, those first 7 years of a child's life is when all the imprinting is done. So creating this type of paradigm in those years is what might breed a culture that is okay with top-down control. I do find that to be an interesting idea. We've talked about it in the school system. Of course, it's very obvious there, but to think that it goes even deeper and even further back is quite compelling. I really don't know what to think about it, but I like the concept of exploring it.
Well, so the thing is that basically what Reich notes in his book is that more tribal societies that were not really at a civilized level of development, what we would call civilization, where there's large social structures and centralized authority. You know, you might have a council of elders or things like that, but it wasn't something, you know, where there was a huge amount of power that anyone could really have over anybody else. And people were always allowed to speak out their viewpoint in meetings with the elders and things like that. So it has a lot to do with authority in and of itself. And the thing is, as you civilize, basically what you're doing is you're planting crops, you're getting livestock, and you're basically trying to assert your authority on nature. So right there's a inherent kind of authoritarian aspect to what people think of as the civilization procedure. And then also on top of that, as these societies start to grow, they start to create cities where you have more separation between the production of food and the consumption of food, and you start to have more of a hierarchy and more of a bureaucracy that becomes involved. You need to extract more food from the people who are working at the periphery of the city to feed it in order to be able to support the populations that you have. And in doing so, there becomes a concentration of power and wealth.
See, I always thought I wanted an egalitarian lifestyle, but I've got friends who have visited several communities and came away from them all pretty disappointed. And during the Occupy days, I was pretty involved in the little sub-community that popped up in San Diego with the whole lending libraries and group sharing types of experimentation. And there was some real positivity about it, but without some form of hierarchy, I also just saw a lot of chaos where you have some self-appointed loudmouths taking the stage, and because they were trying to get a consensus for everything, 50 people all had to weigh in on the simplest of things. I guess one example would be there were older folks who came out and said, look, we want to be here rallying against the 1%, but we've got to work tomorrow. So if we're going to stay down here in the city square, we've got to have some quiet hours. And then you got a bunch of homeless hippie kids saying, well, if you have a job, that kind of sounds like your problem, not mine. We just want to play music and spread joy. So there was just no direction and no accountability. And of course, this is just one example, and there are other ways it can be done. But the few examples I do have didn't seem as advantageous as I was expecting. So I guess to make it a question, why does it seem to me that communal living or egalitarian groups typically seem to be just scraping by rather than thriving if they can even get off the ground?
Well, what you're talking about is anarchy to start with.
Yes, it was.
And that's not really what you see in egalitarian societies. You see more input from the people who are involved in doing the work. in those societies and who are involved in actually maintaining the relationships with the land. But you can still have larger accumulations of people, and you can have larger societal structures as long as that link is maintained, that, there is able to be this feedback. But as these indigenous societies become civilized, it becomes almost too big to make that happen in a centralized way.
Of
and
course.
Things tend to centralize as you get into these civilized structures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is evidence of being able to do this. I mean, there's Mondragon in Spain, which is a worker-owned engineering cooperative, and they basically have it so that people are able to vote and control how things are done within the company, and they've been very successful. So it's not like it can't be done in a civilized, environment, but it hasn't tended to work out that way. That's kind of something where that had to be founded on its own to start with. And there are more companies that are starting to look at that model, but there still aren't a whole lot of examples.
Right. And that seems to be one of my issues, is just that there aren't a ton of examples of success in this area. And it could be because of sabotage, co-opting. It could be the same reason why Reichswerk was destroyed. We don't want examples out there that show you a different way. But I guess that leads us to a section about some of the solves for fascism and authoritarianism. If it's so pervasive that the family structure, schooling, and our repressive sexuality are all tied up in it, maybe the aliens built us to be subservient. Maybe there is no other way. What else can we do? How else can we be?
Well, I'd like to get back to that in a little bit, if that's okay.
Sure.
I'd like to continue talking a bit about Reichswerk, and then that is a part of Reichswerk, but I'd like to get through this other section first.
Let's do it.
To kind of explore the sexuality link a bit more, as well as kind of brain anatomy and how that feeds into all this.
I'd love to hear the data that supports that, because it is kind of an out there idea.
Yeah, so I want to start to slog through that first. So one notable difference between matriarchal and patriarchal societies, which Reich does not discuss in great depth, is the form of marriage beyond the monogamous marriage. In his book, he considered it untenable and kept his discussion within the context of monogamous relationships. Polygamy has three main forms. There's polygyny, which is multiple wives, polyandry, which is multiple husbands, and group marriages, which is multiple husbands and multiple wives. Of the 1,231 societies listed in the 1980 Ethnographic Atlas, 186 were found to be monogamous, 453 had occasional polygyny, and 588 had more frequent polygyny, and 4 had polyandry. The expression of polygyny can be characterized by women having little say in the arrangement and be traded for some form of dowry for political, economic, and religious favors being bestowed upon her father as head of the family. Polyandry tends to be characterized by a especially harsh environment, lending to the need for greater stability in the marriage, and this also tends to be arranged. Now, the final form, the group marriage, is one that I find interesting because it can be tied to an example of another organism, the bonobo chimpanzee, which has a very similar social structure. So I actually first found out about this phenomenon. I didn't even know it existed before I saw a documentary where they were talking about a Tibetan town. And basically they showed, women having multiple husbands and husbands having multiple wives. And it was the sort of thing where, you might have 2 or 3 wives, and one of your wives might have 2 or 3 husbands. And, it was just kind of this fluid arrangement where, okay, if you don't really like each other anymore, it isn't going to destroy the family. You just kind of say, okay, well, our marriage is ended. There isn't really any punishment or anything that gets imposed on the family as a result. And you just kind of end things and move on. but you can also keep it going with your other partners that you have. And in this case, typically it's kind of the mother is the root of the family, and the mother's aunts might help out with raising the children as well as the husbands. And the children aren't even really aware of who their father is. They just know that this is my first dad, this is my second dad, this is my third dad.
See, I don't like that. That's the part where I start to be like, do I really want that?
Well, I'm not saying that, I mean, I'm not in any sort of arrangement like that myself. I'm just pointing it out because it has corollaries with the bonobos.
Right. And it's just a different way we could potentially live, and it would have totally different effects. Because you can see how dowries and the purchasing of wives and the authoritarian father creates a little totalitarian state in the household. You can see that. So it is worth exploring alternatives.
But even without having, this plurality of relationships, you could still have, I mean, our current society, it's definitely centered around the father and the father's family.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the wife typically goes to be with him. So but in this other arrangement, this more maternal arrangement, it's actually the family doesn't typically get broken up when there's a ending of the marriage. The father just kind of goes on and does what he wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
So there isn't a real breakup of the family. There's still the aunts who are able to be leveraged and things like that. So, but I mean, this is also in a small town, so it's not like people are really moving away, and extended families are pretty much still intact.
What about data on fatherless households? Now, I know obviously our society has a lot of things, a lot of factors that would be affecting a person's life, but what type of effects does removing that component have? I mean, I guess it might not manifest the way it would in a full society that was doing that kind of thing, but in our society, it seems to create more problems than benefits.
Yeah, there's definitely, I mean, the thing is, in the situation I'm talking about, there would be other father figures.
A bigger network. It's not really an apples to apples comparison, of course.
But also in the patriarchal family, the father is the main breadwinner, and so everybody is kind of dependent on that person.
That's true. And society is structured that if you don't have that figure, it's very, very hard for a single mom to make a living wage, which has all kinds of repercussions.
Yeah, even today. But if you look back at like 40s, 50s, it was completely devastating. I mean, this is why little girls would go to college to meet a man rather than to learn things.
It's true.
Because that's how everything was structured.
Very true.
So I'd like to go ahead and start talking about the bonobo connection.
Absolutely.
So the bonobo chimp was first discovered in 1929 in the form of a skull specimen, and it wasn't really understood to be different from other chimpanzees until the early 50s. So this is an example that would not have been one that Reich himself would have been aware of. In the late 1970s, chimpanzees, which are much more closely related to humans, became the model for the human ancestor. Before that, it was the baboon. The traits that led people to take this model were cooperative hunting, food sharing, tool use, power politics, and primitive warfare. But as bonobo, and so this was kind of seen as the model for why we are who we are, why we have patriarchal societies, why, authority and domination lead our societies. But as bonobo society has begun to be studied in more detail, it provides an alternative view of our closest relatives. The bonobo chimpanzee, in their society, sex is common, often performed in a mock or ritual fashion, and is almost nonchalant as a handshake. While not dominating their interactions, it seems to act as a way to prevent potential conflicts. The charging displays of bonobos are much more subdued than those of common chimpanzees, which can often extend into protracted tantrums in the common chimp. In the common chimp, dominant males keep a tight rein on the reproductive rights of females with a gang of subordinate males. In bonobo society, if a female is accosted by a male, the females will band together to defend her against the stronger male. So while some may point to the role of hierarchy and male domination in natural societies like lions or chimpanzees, really we don't need to look any farther than the bonobo for another model.
It is interesting.
Yeah. Now, what might cause that? Why would free expression of sexuality, why would it act to reduce aggression and reduce domination? Because that is basically the main thrust of Reich's argument, is that that's the case.
No pun intended.
And this is a good example of that. But what would be the underlying cause? Like, okay, you know, the bonobos are rubbing their hoo-has and their wee-wees together, you know, and that's kind of their handshake, and they are a bunch of pussies. So what does that mean?
What are these ape hippie communes doing, man?
Yeah, exactly, right? So if these different modalities of sexual expression have such an influence on the development of character and societal structure, what might be the underlying cause? The amygdala, which controls the fight or flight response, is also responsible for the sex drive. For example, one study found a relation between the size of the amygdala in patients with epilepsy, and another found that patients with a larger amygdala after neurosurgery had greater sex drive. This suggests that the sexual expression and aggression are not just psychologically but physiologically linked. And what we're witnessing in the bonobos is a form of cultural expression which taps into this inherent biology for negating stress and aggression. So it's kind of like a biohack that they've developed in their society. This is completely in agreement with Dr. Rice's assertions and at odds with the current narrative regarding what authority, you know, the origins of authority at a fundamental level. Indeed, it would tend to lend to an authoritarian, egalitarian paradigm rather than a left-right paradigm with regard to fascism. There is more direct research to support this hypothesis, as studies have shown that in response to fear, liberals tend to become more conservative in their thinking, and in response to a lack of fear, like imagining you're invincible, like Superman, conservatives become more liberal in their thinking. You know, those are some interesting studies that have been done. And while we're on the topic of the brain, I think it should be mentioned that the more authority one wields, the less that somebody tends to take into account others' needs and feelings. So this has been recently substantiated by showing that people in positions of authority are actually not having the same mirror neuron responses than people with little or no authority. The role of power on the psyche has often been likened to being drunk. And this is kind of what that shows, is you become kind of emotionally dampened as a result of power. So to explore the current paradigm of thought with regard to the left-right paradigm further, we should start to talk about what fascism has been commonly defined as in the past. A lot of people think of the quote by Benito Mussolini, which I'm not even sure where it might be attributed to in terms of the original source, but it says, fascism should rightly be called corporatism, as this is the merger of corporate and government power. In practice, liberals tend to think of it as as corporations controlling the government, and conservatives tend to think of it as government controlling corporations, in both cases expressed by a dominating Kafkaesque bureaucracy. The embodiment of each of these modes can be found in the fascist or communist models that are commonly understood, but I believe this is a bit of a simplification, and one which leads to the left-right thinking that I'm discussing right now.
Mm-hmm.
In this paradigm, there are two sources of power, the state and the corporation. People are not really part of this equation, as each of these sources of power is hierarchical and bureaucratic in nature. Today, people rank themselves along a political spectrum of left and right, where left is characterized by state power and right is characterized by corporate power. This dichotomy is limiting and does not accurately characterize the source of power or the different ways that power can be expressed. For instance, during the Middle Ages in Europe, it would have been definitely characterized as an authoritarian regime with an autocratic ruler granted authority by a larger religious body with its own autonomous leader. This doesn't fit into the definition of fascism in either case, but little difference would be noticed by the average person on the street, besides from which philosophy is being espoused when you compare feudalism with communism or fascism.
Right.
So I believe the left-right paradigm is a sort of mental trap designed to limit people's thinking in a way that is mirrored across opposing perspectives and that leads to opposite conclusions based off of the same information.
Fair enough. I think that's a great breakdown. And maybe to amend the definition that refers to it as just corporations, you could just say corporations and cabals. I mean, little groups of top-down leadership. Is that fair to say?
It's basically a merger of state and corporate power where, in the case of the Middle Ages, the state was a dictatorship, and
right.
It was granted its legitimacy by the other main industry at the time, which was religion.
Right. You could consider that a corporation, basically.
Basically a big monopoly on people's spirituality that was, sucking up tithes and issuing, what was it called? It was what Martin Luther spoke out against when he tapped his little decree on the door of the church. It was where they were basically handing out pieces of paper to forgive people for their sins and charging them obscene amounts of money. I can't remember off the top of my head. So I guess at this point, I think we should probably talk about the last part of Wilhelm Reich's discussion about fascism, and that is work democracy.
Yeah, interesting premise for sure.
Yeah, so basically in the past, we've had different ways of organizing work. One way was basically you paid someone to perform a task. You might have a person who was a slave, and in Roman times, maybe they voluntarily sold themselves into slavery, or in colonial times, they were often captured and forced into slavery. You might also have a debt-slave relationship in the form of indentured servitude. But now what a lot of people are talking about is wage slavery. And I think that's, a very good concept to start with, since a lot of your listeners would be familiar with that.
Oh, yeah.
But basically the idea is that you're dependent on a wage. You have to have that in order to be able to meet your needs. And in order to do so, you basically sell your sovereignty to an employer and say, okay, I will be here this many hours a week. While I'm there, I'm your robot. I'm your tool. Do with me as you wish. And, I can't really say anything about it. But in the legal framework, you're not just a robot. You're not just a tool. You aren't just being manipulated to exact the will of your master. You are still a person, but it's basically kind of an abridged personhood while you're in that relationship. Because if you don't comply with what you're being told, then you can be fired for insubordination under basically every labor law that's around. But the thing is, if something criminal is going on, you're still culpable. If you do a criminal act as a part of your job, or you're being asked to, then you're in a catch-22 where you basically have to resign. You can't say no according to labor law, but you're still responsible if you do this criminal act.
Right.
And that is really just kind of showing that you're still responsible for your actions. You're just granted no authority. The idea of work democracy, as Reich talks about it, is basically the idea that you would have some authority over your work. In the case of working for a corporation or working for a business, it would be the sort of situation where, okay, I'm here, and typically what's done today in a lot of cooperatives or a lot of work democracy sort of arrangements is that you go to an assembly or something like that once a week to kind of give feedback on the overall flow of things, but it's still kind of hierarchical in reality. A lot of the day-to-day stuff, your boss is still responsible to you, but it's not really as direct as I think it should perhaps be, I would say, it should be the sort of thing where you actually elect your boss.
Mm-hmm.
Could you imagine if, say, you have a bunch of factory workers or you have a bunch of engineers and you say, who's the best among us for this job? Let's hold a vote. And you actually elect the project leader for this project because that's the person you think would be best. Or, you elect your boss because that's the most knowledgeable and the person that you think would be able to reflect the needs of not just a corporation, but the rest of the people in your group.
Right. Like a captain of the ship that the crew can believe in and support.
Yeah. And, it would be the sort of thing where it's not like every single decision is made by voting. Once you get to that sort of level, you're getting into analysis paralysis and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of thing where there needs to be a balance. There needs to be balance between somebody always getting their will and mob rule, so kind of this
Right.
dictator mob rule kind of dynamic. But by allowing people to say, okay, I think you should be in charge. And then once that person is in charge, you could have a recall vote if enough people think, hey, what the fuck is this guy doing?
Yeah.
Or like if there's any one policy where it's just like everybody's like, I don't think so. I think we should hold a vote to override that decision, But on a day-to-day basis, the guy's not being an asshole. The guy's, making reasonable decisions. There's no need for any of that stuff to even happen. It would just be normal workplace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it would be the sort of thing where maybe once every year or two, or every time there's a new project, someone would be chosen. And typically it would be, you're not going to just say, okay, let's pull some person off the street we've never met before, and let's make him in charge just based off of maybe an hour with him. When you're talking about something like this, where it's like, these are people you've known for years, typically just to even get into one of these cooperatives, you have to work there for a year or two so that they know that you're not going to steal, you're not going to be dishonest, you actually know how to do your job. And then you're able to, join the cooperative as a full member with voting rights.
Right.
Kind of like a contractor sort of a thing today, except most contractors, they get told they're going to be hired on and then they aren't.
Well, how many people out there have some know-nothing boss that just has this corporate personality and is the figurehead of the company just because they're so politically correct they can navigate conversations without actually getting into the nitty-gritty of what the company is actually doing? And, people don't feel respected at their workplace, and that's one of the big reasons they loathe it so much. So to have some say in its structure would be, of course, ideal. I mean, who's going to argue against that except the corporate cabals?
As I was talking about before with the brain research that was done on authority, the less that your boss is accountable to you or to other people, the less they even consider your viewpoint or your views or what you have to say.
Right.
And so the more concentrated this power becomes, the more authority one wields, the less the more power drunk they become, the less accountable they are to anyone.
Yeah, it's goddamn Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings, all that sort of stuff. So this is a way to deal with that research finding, is to say, okay, well, now you're accountable. If you're constantly beating up on this poor schlub who works for you for no good reason, they're going to notice, other people are going to notice. That's the thing, is this stuff gets covered up by authority and it gets covered up by politics in the normal workplace. But in a workplace like this, people wouldn't, it's like the female bonobos being like, what the fuck are you doing, asshole? You're not going to come over here and rape our girl. She doesn't want you around.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of change in mindset. It doesn't mean that it has to devolve into an anarchist or, this analysis paralysis, constantly voting sort of situation that a lot of people jump to immediately. I mean, to me, I think it's kind of sad, and it's an indictment of our society today that we are in the first established democracy in the modern world. And yet you talk about work democracy and everybody's like, oh, fuck, look at this communist guy. What the fuck are you doing here? You lefty, get the fuck out of here.
Right. We can't even conceive of having a little power in the workplace. We're so brainwashed for top-down dominance.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that nothing like this ever actually happened in the Soviet Union. For all their talk about, workers' freedom and worker control, it just turned into the party control, this authoritarian, heavy-handed, and controlling plan that was imposed on everyone. And like I said before, there wasn't really any difference between the factory worker in Soviet Russia or in Nazi Germany. There wasn't really any difference whether you were a Jew in a concentration camp or whether you were a Russian engineer who got sent to the Gulag.
Right.
It doesn't really matter at that point.
They get us trapped in this left versus right thing and looking at these examples in history and be like, well, look at all the death communism has caused. Capitalism's caused a lot of death too. But regardless of the debate, it's like we're stuck in a paradigm where we're still looking at the people being pushed around by top-down authoritarians. And so neither of those is the example we want to look at. We can't find one for what exactly we're trying to look at.
Well, the thing is that a lot of the examples got basically killed off during the colonial expansion after the Renaissance. It was mainly the church who was doing this. The Catholic Church was basically going around, oh, who do you believe in? Oh, you don't know about Jesus? Well, fuck you.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna chop your head off and you're gonna chop your hands off. Okay, next in line. Do you believe in Jesus? Oh, fuck yeah, I believe in Jesus.
Yeah.
And they burned they burned their culture. They burned it to the ground. And there were a lot of indigenous people who ended up kind of hiding it within their expression of the church. They still had little vestiges of it here and there, so they could, kind of do things to their old ways on the slide, but still a lot of it got lost.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And this colonial domination wiped out a lot of our examples, to tell you the truth.
Well, and it's just so funny that in modern times, whether you're on the left or the right, a lot of people look at either Obama or Trump as this father figure, this savior figure. It is pretty much like people look at these people like the second coming of Christ. And it's just this savior motif of like, oh, well, once we get the right guy in there for the top-down control, then everything's going to be all right. And it's just the same revolving door of false hopes. And maybe we should look at changing the model entirely.
Well, that's the thing is, like I was saying with that brain research, the more authority is concentrated, the less it's responsible to the people who are granting that authority in reality, then the worse things are going to be no matter what. They just aren't going to give a shit because they don't have to give a shit.
Right.
And
what would be some of the primary safeguards against that? Like if you were to throw out a couple of things that would be the non-negotiables for a society with a more advantageous structure, what are those things that the oily appendages of the elite aren't going to be able to navigate around?
So I think there needs to be, definitely a private industry and state control, both. If you have one or the other and there's no checks on private interests and the public interest is, or the public interest is dominating everything, then, you end up with the same sort of end result. But there needs to be a balance between them where I think the line would be what is essential for life, what's essential for the functioning of our planet and for an economy. And believe me, our economy is a subset of the ecology of our planet.
Oh, yeah.
All of our industries are dependent on natural resources. You can't divest them from that. And that's a big problem with a lot of economic theory today, is just thinking that you can grow infinitely on a finite planet. So first of all, I think there needs to be both private and public, because the thing with public control is it's always going to be just because of the fact that the state's going to be, it should be larger than any one economic entity to keep them in check. But because of that size, there's going to be but, not so big that it stifles the rights of the citizen. But there's also going to be kind of an inherent slowness of response. And that can be a good thing and that can be a bad thing because, there can be a surplus for these essential services that's built up in a government or a public entity that can't really be done in a private entity, not one that's not so big that it becomes a monopoly anyway. And there needs to be private expression because in the economy, because it's more efficient in the long run, it's more adaptive. But the thing is, you can't have any one group able to dominate the others. So there needs to be a level playing field. And I also think that, just kind of due to human psychology, a person can't keep track of more than about 100 to 120 contacts, something like that. So that was kind of like the optimized village size back in pre-industrial civilization. And that was just kind of because everybody kind of knew everybody else. They knew who they were dealing with. They were able to have long-lasting relationships and things like that. So, when you get into these larger structures of private entities, then things start to be able to get a bit out of control.
That also helps to guard against centralization, because an organization that gets too big is obviously going to get pushed towards centralized control just for the sake of tidiness and efficiency.
Yeah. That's the thing, is basically that essential services, this kind of safeguarding the role of the commons, is basically where the state lands. And then things that aren't essential services, things that aren't like healthcare or fire prevention or, making sure that there's enough natural resources for industry to exist even, it can fall into this more of a kind of a free-for-all. But if you have, this work democracy built into it, then it's the sort of thing where there will be more self-regulation, and it won't even have to get up to the state regulation level, because who's going to be a part of a company where you have a vote and you're able to work things out between yourself and your boss? Who's going to vote for poisoning their environment when they live there?
Right.
If that's imposed on you, okay, gotta do it. Otherwise, I'm out of here. And I got the kids to pay, I got the kids to pay for their school, and my dog's, he's got a gimpy leg, and my wife's, oh man, she's not looking too hot today, so she's not working. I better just pump the stuff down the drain, So.
Right. But if it's some board of executives on Wall Street who only give a shit about the dollars coming in and they don't care what goes on in these environments outside of the city, then you're, of course, going to have problems, and nobody's going to be wanting to correct it if the money train is still coming in.
And there's also, have you ever watched the documentary, The Corporation?
Yeah, it's very good. The psychoanalysis of a corporation, if it was an actual person, and how it would be completely psychopathic.
Exactly. Yes. And that's basically the way that we have it set up. The owners are the shareholders, and the only thing that the leader, the kind of autonomous leader at the top, is really responsible for is for those shareholders and their profits. So it's a completely self-interested kind of modality. That's really what characterizes psychopathy and sociopathy, is always putting yourself in front of others, not in a protective sense, like I need to protect myself from others, but in an exploitive sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably a good lead into our next topic, which would be, a little bit about libertarian psychology and philosophy.
Sure. Let's talk about that, because, I have actually gotten into it with some of the libertarian guests I've had, because while I do agree that I'd like less state control in a broad sense, if you remove it entirely, you have a world run by corporations who will no doubt exploit every worker they can, every consumer base they can, and will just trash the planet until there is nothing left. I know our current regulatory agencies are completely compromised, but just to think that free markets and corporate cabals will police themselves is insane.
Yes, I totally agree. Now, to get into this, I think we should start a little bit with some studies into the psychology of libertarians?
Cool.
Okay. It looks like there was a survey by yourmorals.org, which basically had everybody place themselves on a left-right scale. And it allowed people to choose libertarian as an option. Now, in a project led by Ravi Ehler, they analyzed the results from nearly 12,000 self-described libertarians and compared their responses of 21,000 conservatives and 97,000 liberals. The paper was published last week in PLOS ONE. Findings largely confirm what libertarians have been said about themselves. So here is what the results of what the study said. Libertarians match liberals in placing a relatively low value on the moral foundations of loyalty, authority, and sanctity. They're not so concerned about sexual issues and flag burning, but they join conservatives in scoring lower than liberals on care and fairness foundations, where fairness is mostly equality, not proportionality, i.e. they don't want a welfare state and heavy-handed measures to force equality. This is why libertarians can't be placed on the spectrum from left to right. They have a unique pattern that is, in no sense, just somewhere in the middle. They really do put liberty above all other values. On reasoning and emotions, most libertarians are of a masculine style. Liberals are the most feminine. Measures of empathizing and systemizing, which refers to the drive to analyze the variables in a system and derive the underlying rules that govern behavior of the system, men tend to score higher on this variable, and libertarians score the lowest of the three groups on empathizing and the highest on systemizing. So in this and other measures, libertarians come out as cerebral, rational, and the least emotional. And to me, that kind of sounds a little bit spectrumy. You know what I'm saying? And actually, I think that people who have, because the thing is that somebody who's on the spectrum from autism to Asperger's, those are kind of lower grades of psychopathy in a way, but it manifests differently. They aren't. It isn't that they are trying to exploit others or they're trying to take advantage of others. They just can't really relate to others. It's more of like a handicap rather than like this monstrous, violent, and damaging manifestation. But it also tends to make them higher functioning in terms of their rationalization and their ability to do things in a logical and ordered manner.
Fair enough, man, but that is pretty harsh. I do understand what you're saying, though. It's kind of like, leave me alone. I'm going to do what I'm doing over here, and just you do what you do over there. But if everybody does that, there's going to be conflicts in certain areas. It's like the classic issue with Gary Johnson when he was actually booed off the stage at a libertarian rally because he was trying to argue that, well, we can't just let blind people get driver's licenses. And it's like, well, who are you to say? What authority do you have to infringe on the rights of the blind to drive?
I'm not saying that all libertarians are on the spectrum by any means.
No, but I get what you're saying, and that's an example of how it can go off the rails.
Yeah, I think of it, in my mind, I have a distinction between psychopathy and sociopathy. This comes from a book called Political Ponerology. It was actually written by a scientist. I can't remember if it was a psychiatrist or just a psychoanalyst or something like that, but he was basically one of those two, and he was living in Nazi Germany. No, he was living in Poland, and when Poland was invaded, he was pursued by the Nazis. And then he ended up writing this book about his experiences, because I think he was captured and imprisoned. But basically what he says is that psychopaths are people who are the way they are, typically because of a trauma that they've endured. And it actually impacts them at such a fundamental level that it completely twists their psychology at a biological level.
Well, just look at how the elite apparently raise their own kids. Something you sent me talked about how Trump was raised and how he raised his own kids, and it was an exact match for what the Rothschild family does, where the father is constantly trying to trick his own children, gives them basically no love, and says, look, the world is a cold, hard place and nothing is fair and everybody's trying to fuck you. And so you better fuck them first. And I mean, that's traumatizing to a child. So it's no surprise these people grow up to be psychopaths.
Yeah. And there is a genetic component to this. It seems that there are certain bloodlines and groups of people who are more susceptible to this trauma activating their genes to express this, because there are people who still carry that gene and they don't, they're a bit emotionally stunted, but they aren't full-blown psychopathic. They might not always take people into consideration as much as others, but I think what it is that trauma is really kind of a catalyst to creating this kind of epigenetic link where that genealogy is expressed.
Makes sense. Like, you can have a predisposition, but if it isn't triggered by trauma, it won't be quite so severe. It won't show as much in your personality.
Yeah, it's kind of like there's celiac disease where people end up not being able to handle gluten protein. And this is where, all this gluten-free stuff comes from. But people will often go for years eating gluten as a child and it won't affect them. And then one day they have a bowl of Cheerios and their stomach feels like it's on fire and they start seeing lights and getting a migraine and they're in bed for 3 days. So, it can be that quick if there's the right stimulus. So getting back to it, sociopathy, I think of as more of somebody who is in the psychopathic mindset. And the distinction that they give in psychology between these is that somebody who's sociopathic, they're able to regulate their response around others to a larger degree to the psychopathic person who basically they don't have that impulse control. Now, I would say that somebody who's psychopathic is somebody where this gene expression has been turned on and the way their brain processes information has changed and their mirror neurons are not firing at the same rate everybody else's is. And they can't control that on any sort of conscious level anymore. Sociopaths, I think, are more people who are kind of inculcated or, they end up getting acclimated to a culture that's sociopathic or psychopathic. And a lot of times what will end up happening is some toxic or psychopathic person gets into an organization and they build up their own little cult around them, where they end up recruiting people who are prone to developing this more sociopathic behavior. And you see that a lot in cults of personality giving rise to fascist or communist bureaucracies and organizations. So, speaking of cults of personality, I think it would be a good time to get into Rand and her influence on libertarianism.
Sure. A lot of people worship her, and the links you sent me were pretty interesting about her background and why she might think the way she did.
Yeah, so one thing you got to realize is that Rand, she actually grew up in Tsarist Russia, and when the revolution happened, basically she went from being her daddy's little princess and her dad, he was very, he was kind of some of the elite in that country. He owned a pharmacy, made very good money, had an upper middle class sort of lifestyle. And then all that was ripped away when the revolution happened. And basically they took his pharmacy and he vowed that he'd never work for them. And I think I've got a quote here. So her name was Alyssa at the time. She was Alyssa Rosenbaum. What she said was she saw the look on her father's face as, he was basically being torn from his pharmacy shop. And she said that I felt the way he looked. His was one of helplessness, murderous frustration, and indignation. He could do absolutely nothing. This event and the subsequent starvation that he and his family suffered begging on the streets of St. Petersburg left a very great trauma in Ayn Rand's mind as she was growing up. She ended up asking one of her relatives to help her move to the United States, and they altruistically gave her some money to do so in 1925. After she arrived, she changed her name to Ayn Rand and started to kind of pick up where most people who are libertarian would probably know a bit more about her past. But there is one aspect that probably they don't know about, and that would be her admiration of the serial killer William Hickman.
That is an interesting aspect for sure. What can you tell us about that?
When Ayn Rand was coming up with her idea of an ideal man, which she leveraged a lot in a lot of her, you could call it literature. I use that term a bit loosely because it's very one-dimensional. I'd say it's kind of a juvenile literature in the way it's written. And I mean, I'm just kind of being objective here. I'm not really trying to badmouth people who like it, but I'm saying what I think. But she had this ideal man, this kind of Superman image that she wanted to build up in each of her books. And a lot of that came from her father and his ideals and his personality. But there was another figure which factored into this a great deal. And it was actually this serial killer, William Hickman. And, most people, well, what are you talking about? How could that possibly be? So I'm going to read a little bit here, if that's okay, from a story called How Ayn Rand Became a Big Admirer of Serial Killer William Hickman by Mark Ames of Alternet.
All right.
So the best way to get to the bottom of Ayn Rand's beliefs is to look at how she developed the superhero of her novel Atlas Shrugged, John Galt. Back in the late 1920s, as Ayn Rand was working out her philosophy, she became enthralled by real-life American serial killer William Edward Hickman, whose gruesome, sadistic dismemberment of a 12-year-old girl named Marion Parker in 1927 shocked the nation. Rand filled her early notebooks with worshipful praise of Hickman. According to biographer Jennifer Burns, author of Goddess of the Market, Rand was so smitten with Hickman that she modeled her first literary creation, Danny Renahan, the protagonist of her unfinished novel, The Little Street, on him. So this is what she had to say about Hickman. Rand said, "Other people do not exist for him, and he does not see why they should." She gushed that Hickman had no regard whatsoever for all that society holds sacred, and with a consciousness of all his own. He has the true, innate psychology of a Superman. He can never realize and feel other people. They go on to say this echoes almost word for word Rand's later description of her character Howard Rourke, the hero of The Fountainhead. He was born without the ability to consider others. The Fountainhead is a Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's favorite book, even requires his clerks to read it. So, and that's actually a common theme with a lot of the fans of Rand, is that they require other people to read his books. And I knew somebody before who tried to get me to read one of her books, and I could only really get through about the first 40 pages. And that's because what our bet was whether I would stop at that point, and I could barely get through it just because it was so rough to read. Just the callousness and kind of the one-dimensional characters, the kind of fey woman swooning and this very dominant male character. And most people didn't really have much of a backstory. They just kind of were there saying things at you. And the words that were in their mouths were Ayn Rand's words. So getting back to what she thought of William Hickman, she said he was a genuinely beautiful soul. So I think at this point it would be a good idea to talk about what Hickman actually did.
Sure.
To kind of give an idea of who this person was that she admired so much and what, maybe she admired about him. Rand fell for William Edward Hickman in the 1920s as the shocking story of Hickman's crimes started to grip the nation. He was the O.J. Simpson of his day. His crime, trial, and case were nonstop headline grabbers for months. Hickman, who was only 19 when he was arrested for murder, was the son of a paranoid schizophrenic mother and grandmother. His schoolmate said that as a kid, Hickman liked to strangle cats and snap the necks of chickens for fun. Most of the kids thought he was a budding maniac. although adults gave him good marks for behavior, a typical sign of a sociopathic cunning. He enrolled in college but quickly dropped out and then turned to violent crime, largely driven by the thrill and arrogance typical of sociopaths. In a brief and wild crime spree that grew increasingly violent, Hickman knocked over dozens of gas stations and drugstores across the Midwest and west to California. Along the way, it's believed he strangled a girl in Milwaukee and killed his crime partner's grandfather in Pasadena, tossing his body over a bridge after taking his money. Hickman's partner later told police that Hickman told him how much he'd like to kill and dismember a victim someday, and that day did come for Hickman. One afternoon, Hickman drove up to Mount Vernon Junior High in Los Angeles, telling administrators he'd come to pick up the Parker girl. Her father, Perry Parker, was a prominent banker. Hickman didn't know the girl's first name, so when he was asked which of the two Parker twins, he answered, the younger daughter. Then he corrected himself, the smaller one. No one suspected his motives. The school administrator fetched young Marion and brought her out to Hickman. Marion obediently followed Hickman to his car as she was told, where he promptly kidnapped her. He wrote a ransom note to Marion's father demanding $1,500 for her return, promising the girl would be left unharmed. Marion was terrified into passivity. She even waited in his car for Hickman when he went to mail his letter to her father. Hickman's extreme narcissism comes through in his ransom letters, as he refers to himself as the mastermind and not a common crook. Hickman signed his letter The Fox because he admired his own cunning. Fox is my name, very sly, you know. And then he threatened, get this straight, your daughter's life hangs by a thread. Hickman and the girl's father exchanged letters over the next few days as they arranged the terms of the ransom, while Marion obediently followed her captor's demands. She never tried to escape the hotel where he kept her. Hickman even took her to a movie. She never screams for help. She remains quiet and still, as told when Hickman tied her to a chair. He didn't even bother gagging her because there was no real need to, right up to the end. Hickman's last ransom note to Marion's father is where the story reaches its disturbing end. Hickman fills the letter with hurt anger over her father's suggestion that Hickman might deceive him and ask you for $1,500 for a lifeless mass of flesh. I am base and low, but I won't stoop to that depth, is what Hickman said as he wrote the letter. Marion had already been chopped up into several lifeless masses of flesh. Why taunt the father? Why feign outrage? This sort of bizarre taunting was all part of the serial killer's thrill, maximizing his sadistic pleasure. But this was nothing compared to the thrill Hickman got from murdering the helpless 12-year-old Marion Parker. Here is an old newspaper description of the murder taken from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. It was while I was fixing the blindfold that the urge to murder came over me. I couldn't help myself. I got a towel and stepped up behind Marion. Then before she could move, I put it around her neck and twisted it tightly. I held on and she made no outcry except to gurgle. I held on for about 2 minutes, I guess, and I let go. When I cut loose the fastenings, she fell to the floor. I knew she was dead. Well, after she was dead, I carried her body into the bathroom and undressed her, all but the underwear, and cut a hole in her throat with a pocket knife to let the blood out. He then took a pocket knife and cut a hole in her throat, cut off each arm to the elbow, cut her legs off at the knees. He put the limbs in a cabinet. He cut up the body in his room at the Bellevue Arms Apartments. Then he removed the clothing and cut the body through at the waist. He put it on a shelf in the dressing room. He placed a towel in the body to drain the blood. He wrapped up the exposed end of the arm and waist with paper. He combed back her hair, powdered her face, and then with a needle affixed her eyelids. He did this because he realized he would lose the reward if he did not have the body to produce to her father. So this is what he was doing as he wrote that note.
Dark stuff.
Hickman packed her body, limbs, and entrails into a car and drove to the drop-off point to pick up his ransom. Along the way, he tossed out wrapped up limbs and innards, scattering them around Los Angeles. When he arrived at the meeting point, Hickman pulled Marion's head and torso out of a suitcase and propped her up. Her torso was wrapped tightly to look like she was alive. He sewed wires into her eyelids to keep them open so that she'd appear to be awake and alive. When Miriam's father arrived, Hickman pointed a sawed-off shotgun at him, showed him Marion's head and eyes sewn open. It would have been hard to see for certain that she was dead from his position, and then took the ransom money and sped away. As he sped away, he threw Miriam's head and torso out of the car, and that's what the father ran up to when he saw his daughter and screamed.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's about as dark as it gets. And for Rand to think of this person as someone to be admired, obviously it shows that, she's taken this ideal in her mind of, this rational self-interest and has taken it to a pathological extreme.
Mm-hmm.
So, I can go on a bit more, but I think when her father was demasculated in front of her and lost everything at the hands of what she perceived as, society or the forces of the mob or, community or other people, she kind of related to her father's indignation and individualism to such a degree that it became this pathological expression of that.
That would be that trauma. Well, what do Rand fans say about this association or this Hickman appreciation?
I've never got anyone to actually talk about it. I've mentioned it before, and they just kind of roll their eyes and think that it's just fake news sort of a thing. They don't even acknowledge it.
I did read a little bit about it because I was curious, and basically the only thing I could find was someone who's like, these are all things taken out of context. But it is a fact that she only talked about Hickman in her private journals, which indicates she had an appreciation for him, but didn't necessarily want it to be out there in the open.
Yeah.
At least that's how I took that.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, all of her relationships were very skewed. If you've ever done any research into the Collective, which is really for the Ayn Rand fan club / think tank, that's a pretty weird name, isn't it? I mean, she was so against collectivism in any form, and yet she named her group the Collective. So I don't have any understanding how that even came about, but it's interesting.
Right. So basically, we're just pointing out here, I guess, that libertarianism seems to have some shaky foundation, some shaky founders.
Yeah, I definitely think so. When you look into its history in terms of how it actually came about, there's definitely corporate special interests who are involved in promoting it. So, I mean, Rand just kind of followed on this promotion, and I mean, she soaked it up. She loved it, but it was they were very complementary to each other in the way that was expressed. So one of these corporate groups that was involved in promoting libertarianism was the Foundation for Economic Freedom, and it was founded by U.S. Chamber of Commerce executive Leonard Reed, and his top contributors included General Motors, Chrysler, Consolidated Edison, DuPont, Gulf Oil, U.S. Steel. Notice a pattern here with the American Liberty League, Montgomery Ward, Armour, and B.F. Goodrich. So a lot of the same groups that were involved in founding the American Liberty League were actually involved in the Foundation for Economic Freedom.
Why wouldn't corporate think tanks support an ideology that gets rid of all regulation and gives them free rein? I mean, it just makes too much sense.
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of the FEE and libertarianism in general was to supplement big business lobbying with pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-economic rationale to back up its policy and legislative attacks on government regulations. So that's kind of the start of it, but it really, really takes off as things are suffering for them in terms of the Nixon Watergate situation. So basically by that point, there's no faith in politics. There's no faith in a lot of these more libertarian ideals. And the response was basically that one of the aides for Richard Nixon outlined a plan to put what he called the GOP on TV. And the idea was to basically create a news network that would, and initially basically what it was, this wasn't when it was Fox News, but when it was another name. Let me see here. I can find it real quick. So when Ailes founded Television News Incorporated, which he called Fair and Balanced in the 1970s, basically it was this company that would make propaganda, and then they would sell it at cut rate prices, almost fire sale prices, to different networks. And so it was basically a way to generate content that would be picked up all over the place and would cost them, a lot less than producing it themselves. But it was just to kind of get the word out there, kind of a thing. And eventually that did grow into Fox News, but it was, in the words of a news director who quit in protest, a propaganda machine. That's what it was, pure and simple. It was just a propaganda machine to put out this libertarian message. So that has basically, resulted in a large number of people being brainwashed to a degree into this sort of thinking that if we get rid of all government authority, and it's always government, it's never corporate. They don't ever look at the corporate side of power. They say, if we just get rid of government, I won't be taxed as much as I am. I'll be able to, or a very tiny government that barely does anything really, other than, I guess, make sure that the streets are paved and businesses don't catch fire so that business can keep going on. But this idea basically comes out of this backlash that happened after the Nixon Watergate scandal and the overall wave of progressive and socialistic legislation that had gotten passed after the New Deal and during the 60s and 70s. So it was basically designed to help dismantle that. And today we've seen the result is that most of that legislation, which was built up over about 40 or 50 years, has completely gone. There's nothing left of it for the most part, just vestiges, if anything. Now, should we go ahead and start talking about the Russian Revolution in more deep? I could talk briefly about fascism and socialism, or do you want me to just go to?
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be important just so we can say that we were even-handed in the discussion about fascism and its many wrappers. And then from there, we can go into beastmen and gods in that whole chapter. Okay.
So one thing about all this, and I can kind of hear the arguments going in my head is, well, fascism, Nazis weren't really fascists, they were socialists. And one of the problems with this is that in name, they had the name National Socialist Party. But the thing is that when you actually look at what they did in terms of their actual policies, like there were a few places where the industry had completely fallen apart, and they did nationalize it for preparation for this war effort. But aside from that, there wasn't really any takeover of industry or anything like that, or any regulation of normally functioning industry. So it was basically a way to provide an authoritarian hierarchy that would express corporate and industrial interests, especially during and after the war, the buildup, all this stuff. You can see that there was this link with industrialists in other countries, like America, and this attempted coup in the United States, and all these links with industrialists in Britain as well. So that's something that I think needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's pretty much it. I think we've gone through everything.
Right on. Yeah, I mean, that is just a real whirlwind of information, a Fascism 101 that I think is pretty appropriate. I know I learned some things for sure. Hopefully people agree. And it is kind of tough to navigate these waters sometimes because it does get political and there is so much emotion around a person's ideology and politics that they're very guarded to hear it criticized, or they'll pay attention to making sure there was a 50-50 split between criticisms of both sides, because people just think everything is an op and that ideas aren't implemented necessarily the way they're talked about. Everybody gets very skeptical of that notion as well. So it's a bit of a ideological minefield to navigate, but I do think we talked about both sides, and at its core, we're talking about corporate collusion, rule by authority, and these are ideas that anyone should be able to say, yeah, I don't support that. So, maybe cut through some of the manipulation and propaganda and just see at the core, we're talking about trying to free people, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what it's really about. And the last thing I would have to say is take a few minutes and go listen to that audio snippet I sent you. And I'll think for you that it kind of ties everything together at the end.
Right on. Well, man, this has been a bit of a marathon session. Again, I do think it's important stuff. I guess I would also ask you before we go, is there anything else to say about the return to the Elemental Alchemy series? Anything to say in terms of the preview for the next element on the list?
So I was planning on getting back to the Elemental series and going to the Fire episode next. And then later on, I would get to the Mind episode. But we just went through so much psychology and so much, we started to get into some brain structure and things like that. And I think that if we go to the Mind episode next, I can really fill in the whole psychological framework and give people a bit more depth on some of these concepts that we're bringing up and the link between mind and spirituality and quantum biology and things like that, and being able to get into kind of how a lot of this stuff really frickin' works, get into a user manual for the mind.
Yeah, I'm into it. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I just think it'll complement this, and then we can move on and blast through the rest of the Elemental series.
Sure, man. Awesome. Well, again, always enjoy having you here. I will let you enjoy the rest of your day because this has been a long one.
Yeah.
But we will be doing it again. And until that time, take care out there.
Take it easy.
Sweet baby Jesus, dear people of the internet. The triumphant return of Shamangineer. Taking a break from elements to talk about ideologies. And I'll tell you, I was a little hesitant at first. I thought it might be, a bit sober for THC, and probably even a bit polarizing and triggering. Although fascism should be something we all oppose on a conspiracy show, if we could just recognize it appropriately, which is really what this was all about. So I'm really glad we did it. I think it has a unique place in the archive, and it's a topic worth focusing on. It just does get a little dicey when you bring up certain ideologies because so many people have their minds made up, or their definition of something might be way off from another person's definition, and we're all playing straw man games. These are some of the most loaded and propagandized terms in human history, so of course people have strong reactions. But because they're so twisted up, I think that's why we should be open to just unpacking them and taking an objective look. But I do agree that the correct framing is that we have a false dichotomy of leftist ideologies that promote state power, right ideologies that promote corporate power, but nobody's really pushing for people power. Maybe we could look at third options if we were open-minded enough to get over ourselves. I still wrestle with a lot of these ideas, but I think if you're going to be fair, we were pretty even-handed and balanced, and it's really just food for thought. Although the info about corporations changing after the Civil War and the attempted coup on FDR, that's super interesting history. But just in the context of our current times, I like to think that a lot of Higher Side listeners are a bit above the political infighting, but we all see it. And I said this in the show, but everything is getting so extreme that no one is even talking cooperation. It's all about winning. And this mindset of, if the other side would just get the fuck out of the way of my team's ideas, we could fix everything. And it's like, yeah, fix everything for you, but the road to tyranny is paved with good intentions. And gridlock is the goal. So powerful fucks can get you so frustrated with it that you approve the bulldozing of the parts of the system that they don't like. And again, it's not going to do anything for you. I'm not trying to be preachy, and I am no political scientist, but I do think any and all systems have been corrupted by top-down control with rigged economics, violence, exploitation, and cronyism, all of them. So it's really disingenuous to look back at history or the current climate and see one of these clearly corrupt social examples and say to someone, oh, that's what you want? Look at all those people who suffered under that system. You want to bring that back? And it's like, no, of course not. It's like Shamanj said, you can't find examples of free, fair, and open civilizations. Those were wiped out. History does not want those examples to be highlightable or for them to exist today. It's a lot like vaccine studies. The CDC never did MMR studies on non-vaccinated versus vaccinated groups. Only kids vaccinated to the schedule and ones where the schedule was extended, and even that was very telling. But the point is, the planet's puppet masters do not want us to have clear answers, because we can unite around clear answers, in theory. And that's just what a lot of this is. It's just theory talk, because it's not like a complete overhaul of our societal structure is even on the table for us. But maybe if we could point our pitchforks at both the authoritarian government and the rigged corporate cabal instead of each other, we might start to move the needle our way for a change. Maybe. And there isn't just one answer for this. I don't really think Shamanj was trying to shove one answer down anybody's throat. Although we did torch some sacred cows. And I don't really mind making that kind of trouble. It just doesn't seem like people are free to talk openly anymore. I'm reminded of something Dave Chappelle said in his latest special, which was to the effect of, people who care about freedom have a responsibility to talk recklessly, because I worry my kids will grow up in a world where they don't even know what reckless talk sounds like. And not that the show is reckless. In fact, Shamangineer puts a lot of work into getting ready for a THC, and I really appreciate that effort. But the point is, let's throw around some ideas. Let's put them on the table. Let's look at material the state deemed unfit for us. Let's examine why these various structures haven't worked and what it would take to make one work. Let's toss around ideas without being completely married to them and take a conversation to places that not many are really going today. And I'm on board with that. And these episodes with Shamangineer are a bit different. It's not like he writes a book and then I read it and then we go over the finer points. It's more like he's a really smart, thoughtful, passionate guy who synthesizes a ton of information from a ton of sources on a particular topic and creates a form of presentation for us where I occasionally chime in just to remind you I'm still here. But he recorded with me for 3+ hours, which with breaks and side conversations, it was about 4 plus all the preparation. So you got to respect a guy who's got nothing to sell you and still puts in all that time and thoughtfulness to making a good case for something that he cares about. And even still, he did have some addendums that got missed he wanted me to add. He did send me an article about the origins of engineering as a profession and how the way that it's taught is actually infused with authoritarian concepts. It's too long to read, but it's just a great example of how we are brainwashed for top-down control almost everywhere, and we don't realize it. I think that point about the nuclear family setting us up for the mindset of just following orders from some father figure, some goddamn tyrant, that's interesting. I mean, I don't know how else I'd want to raise my kids, but it's worth keeping in mind what type of imprinting you're doing with an operation like that. But yes, he did want me to add a few things, so let's do that. Firstly, we had plans to get to Europe's immigration crisis and tie that into the big picture. And I'm just going to quote him. He said, "I would argue what's going on in Europe with immigration is a kind of shock doctrine or disaster reaction solution approach to overcoming the social programs afforded to citizens in those countries. The impetus to undermine these programs is to make them collapse under the added strain, which they were not designed to bear, resulting in internal conflict and strife. Additionally, fear of loss of identity is being used to shift demographics that are leading to the rise of nationalistic fronts in these countries. The entire response has been focused on the effects of the refugees and limiting damage to the European identity and economy rather than asking what caused the crisis to begin with and how to prevent these people from fleeing their homelands. Believe me, nobody wants to be a refugee. Why has the response not been to organize relief efforts and peaceful solutions to the conflicts that have given rise to the refugee crisis in order to stem the tide before a flood? Isn't this the more logical and ethical response to a humanitarian disaster of such proportions? By allowing these disasters to continue unabated and focusing on the effects, I believe the conditions are being created for fascist policies to become central to the political development of Europe. And that's a sentiment many guests have really shared with me on and off air, that the globalists feel that Europeans have too many benefits, so you break the system with immigrants. Paint them as freeloaders, tell the citizens how much better off they'd be if they just paid for their own benefits, and then collapse the sense of communal safety net, just erode the hell out of that. I think that makes sense. These greedy fucks are always trying to make us get by with less, and the only things we get out of our system are the ones we really, really fight for and draw the line in the sand around. Look at the countries who get the most out of their system on the planet, and it is probably Europe. So when the globalists are thinking about who they can chip away at, that's probably where they're looking. You know, we hit libertarians pretty hard, and they always stick to this taxation is theft principle. And I think taxation is really more of a social contract, but it's a complete shame that we have no control over the allocation of funds. If tax season came around and we all contributed 15% or so, divided into categories of our choosing, I think we'd be a lot more okay with it. Because none of us are self-made, and the structure of our society probably should get a small percentage of our income just for setting up the conditions in which we can make a living. You need this structure to even do what you do. Otherwise, it's just fucking chaos. We're not crouching behind flaming trash cans in the streets, avoiding machine gun-clad militias. So is it that bad to contribute to the ongoing avoidance of a full-scale war zone and chip into the structure that we all appreciate being here, at least to a degree? But on top of those comments about the immigration crisis, he wanted me to say a bit more about beasts, men, and gods. Now, if you only heard the free show, you have no idea what that is. But just like the last show with Shamangineer, the plus portion centers largely around one book with some very strange THC-type material in it. In the water episode, that book was Edidorfa. In this episode, it's Beasts, Men, and Gods by Ferdinand Ossendowski, which is a largely personal memoir about a Russian doctor's experience running from the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1920s, a journey that not only showed him firsthand examples of the death and destruction associated with the revolution, but also brought him in contact with many interesting characters throughout China, Mongolia, and Tibet. Ding, ding, ding. And much like the exploration of Edidorfa, this book is just another example of some of the odd yet consistent details revolving around things below the surface. It contains stories of strange light sources inside the earth, an ancient civilization deep underground, and that this civilization has advanced flying crafts unknown to man at that time. So we spent the second hour, or should I just say the plus portion, because it's really closer to the third hour, but we spent it reading from and branching off of these themes in this particular book. But he wanted me to emphasize that there's a lot more to the story of the Bloody Baron, and that it's really worth reading yourself. You can also find audiobooks of it on YouTube, but he also mentioned that some historians claim that the reason the book ends without really recounting much of how Ossendowski escaped Mongolia is because he might have stole a great deal of the treasure of the Mongolian horde as he fled, and that he buried it along his route with plans to return one day and recover it. And who doesn't love the idea of buried treasure? On top of the inner earth stuff. But on that subject, because he goes to Mongolia and Tibet, he is told a few stories from the people he interacts with about the inner earth civilization of Agartha and the passageway in Tibet. And in the show, we didn't get to the real gem, which is the prophecy of the King of the World, aka the King of Agartha. So it reads, "The Hatuku of Narabanchi related the following to me when I, Ossendowski, visited him in his monastery in the beginning of 1921. The king of the world appeared before the lamas in this monastery 30 years ago, which would be 1890. He made a prophecy for the coming half-century. It was as follows. More and more the people will forget their souls and care about their bodies. The greatest sin and corruption will reign on the earth. People will become as ferocious animals, thirsting for the blood and death of their brothers. The crescent will grow dim, and its followers will descend into beggary and ceaseless war. Its conquerors will be stricken by the sun, but will not progress upward, and twice they will be visited with the heaviest misfortune, which will end in insult before the eye of the other peoples. The crowns of kings, great and small, will fall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There will be a terrible battle among all the peoples. The sea will become red. The earth and the bottom of the sea will be strewn with bones. Kingdoms will be scattered. Whole peoples will die. Hunger, disease, crimes unknown to the law, never before seen in the world. The forgotten and pursued shall rise and hold the attention of the whole world. There will be fogs and storms. Bare mountains shall suddenly be covered with forests. Earthquakes will come. Millions will change the fetters of slavery and humiliation for hunger, disease, and death. The ancient roads will be covered with crowds wandering from one place to another. The greatest and most beautiful cities shall perish in fire. 1, 2, 3. Father shall rise against son, brother against brother, and mother against daughter. Vice, crime, and the destruction of body and soul shall follow. Families shall be scattered. Truth and love shall disappear. From 10,000 men one shall remain. He shall be nude and mad and without force, and the knowledge to build him a house and find his food. He will howl as a raging wolf, devour dead bodies, bite his own flesh, and challenge God to fight. All the earth will be emptied. God will turn away from it, and over it there will be only night and death. There I shall send a people now unknown, which shall tear out the weeds of madness and vice with a strong hand, and will lead those who still remain faithful to the spirit of man in the fight against evil. They will found a new life on earth, purified by the death of nations. In the 15th year, which would be 1940, only 3 great kingdoms will appear, which will exist happily for 71 years until 2011. Afterwards, there will be 18 years of war and destruction until 2019. Then the people of Agartha will come up from their subterranean caverns to the surface of the earth. So as Shamangineer said to me, 1 to 2 years out, Agarthans may be walking among us. But nothing much else in the prophecy seems to have been too accurate, so I wouldn't hold your breath. But it is a quite interesting bit of Hollow Earth lore. And maybe we should just avoid the descent into complete divisiveness just in case. So check out the Plus show to hear that hour, largely about the book, the HighersideChatsPlus.com. Sign up on Patreon. You know how to do it. Shamangineer also wanted me to end the show with Tom Clay's What the World Needs Now. Unfortunately, I can't because of commercial rights. But I think I got just the thing. And I'll catch you later. Your move, international fascists, commies, Nazi survivals, and breakaway civilizations. Your fucking move.
You know the plan has always been to hack your brain. MK Ultra's trying to drive you insane. They'll explode your heart if they think that's what it takes. You think I'm answering the phone? Well, I ain't. You gotta keep the curtains drawn, 'cause you don't want anyone thinking you're at home. Well, you're not. You should tape the mail slot. And baby, if I seem withdrawn, let me say it's 'cause I just don't wanna go and get whacked. Maybe you should know that the trauma affects you like it does everyone. It's just the game plan, it's what the world's become. They want a pat down and a swap. Don't you see what's going on? Well, now you know. You're better keeping on your own, 'cause you can see the masters lie too much. Oh baby, you can only trust yourself. And if you think the system's out of touch, it is, and you can only trust yourself. I hope you know the elite aren't your friends. They'll suck out everything from you in the end. And if for some reason you think I might be wrong, I wonder where you got that opinion from. You gotta keep the curtains drawn, 'cause you don't want anyone thinking you're at home. Well, you're not. You should tape the mail slot. And baby, if I seem withdrawn, let me say it's 'cause I just don't wanna go and get whacked. Maybe you should know that the trauma affects you like it does everyone. It's just the game plan, it's what the world's become. They want a pat down and a swap. Don't you see what's going on? Well, now you know. You're better keeping on your own, 'cause you can see the masters lie too much. Oh baby, you can only trust yourself. And if you think the system's out of touch, it is, and you can only trust yourself. You might think that these problems are small, or maybe they aren't registering at all. Now they know you're naive and vulnerable. You won't believe all of the stunts that they'll pull, 'cause you can see the masters lie too much. Oh baby, you can only trust yourself. And if you think the system's out of touch, it is, and you can only trust yourself. 'Cause you can see the masters lie too much. Oh baby, you can only trust yourself. And if